And welcome back to Racing Rundown. It is finally that time of year, the annual Kentucky Derby preview and picks show. This is the 5th Kentucky Derby that we will have this type of show for on Racing Rundown, and the 4th time that I have Eric with me for the Kentucky Derby. Of course, last year, the results, at least on my end from the win pick perspective, left a lot to be desired. So the goal is once again to try to run better than 16th place in this year's Kentucky Derby. Of course, Eric ran a lot better than I did last year. I thought that overall last year, our Kentucky Derby preview went very well, aside from, for me, Epicenter. But for the most part, us combined, I think that we laid out the Kentucky Derby very, very well. Overall, we had a accurate read on most of the horses that we talked about. Again, from me, Epicenter aside, but fortunately, that's why I have Eric, because Eric got Epicenter right, and I did not because I was a giant idiot. And then also, we were one of the few shows or few racing people out there that projected the pace melting down the way that it did this year in the Kentucky Derby, or last year in the Kentucky Derby. Before we get to that, which we are going to start with the pace like we did last year, I will mention the Kentucky Derby profiles, the individual profiles that we have done for the horses. I'm a lot more organized and on top of getting them out this year than I was last year. Most of them are done. We still do have a couple because we were waiting on jockeys, and we did have Skinner draw into the Kentucky Derby last week. But link below to the playlist with all of those is in the description. Of course, we have our Kentucky Oaks preview where we do the same thing that we are doing here for the Phillies, so you can check that out. And then also check out, be around for this week's episode of Racing Rundown, episode 209, where we will talk about the entire Kentucky Derby weekend cards, and then a very interesting series of races that will be at Belmont Park's opening weekend this year. So without any further delay, I will turn it over to Eric for this week's, I'm used to saying Maiden Watch, if you're a Racing Rundown listener, for this year's Kentucky Derby pace projection, and this will also be the return of the glorious graphic that Eric creates every year for the pace projection. So, Eric, take it away.
Thank you, Jack. And if you listen to our Kentucky Oaks show, you heard me. If you're listening to this show now, you can probably tell voice is a little shot, but we're powering through. Excuse any random interruptions I might have, but we're going to make it happen because we have to. It's the Kentucky Derby. But like you mentioned, Jack, let's dive into this pace projection. Last year was a lot more radical and a lot more evident as to what was going to happen in the Kentucky Derby. We were both very confident. And the map kind of proved that to the highest degree, that the pace was going to be rapid. This year, it's really not neither here nor there. There's not a lot of early speed signed on, but the horses up front are quick enough to potentially force the pace to set up for somebody from off the pace. That being said, I do want to say right now, I don't think being in the last 5 or 6 horses in the field is going to help anybody. In fact, what I am very willing to say is that if you are behind Forte in our projection, you are not winning the Kentucky Derby, because I just don't think there will be enough pace for them to close into. So with that being said, any horse Forte and beyond seems like fair game when you look at this race. Reincarnate, it has been confirmed by connections, kind of was evident last time out, but they want the lead, and they're going to try and go get it. Jace's Road is faster early, though, and they're kind of in the same camp where they didn't get the lead in their final prep. They want it badly because they know that's their horse's best chance to win. So expect those two to be a clear top 2 as long as they get out of the gate. That's kind of the caveat with every single horse in this year's race. But then from there, expect the 17, 18, 19 to kind of collapse over the top of the field. Derma Sotogake, Raise Cain, and Lord Miles. And that'll create a pocket for the 6 horses inside of them. Kingsbarns and Verifying likely to sit within 2 lengths of the lead, probably fourth and 5th early on. Raise Cain will be parked out a little bit. Practical Move will probably be 3 to 4 lengths off the lead, sitting 6th or 7th in the opening stages. And then Mage, Disarm, and Confidence Game could all be at any mid-pack spot, about 5 lengths off the lead, ending off the first half of the field. And then, like I said, Forte will be that last horse in that front bunch of horses before you get to your, kind of tweeners of the mid-pack to closers, and then your few true closers in this race. But yeah, I think you need to be within 6 lengths of the lead early on to win this Kentucky Derby, but I don't necessarily think this Derby can be won on the lead.
And now we're going to segue from that into the first horse in this year's Kentucky Derby, and that's Hit Show, the runner-up from the Wood Memorial. And Hit Show has a couple of major handicaps in addition to being a horse that will be behind Forte, as Eric talked about. That's already something that we project is not going to be advantageous for a horse. He's also one that doesn't have a lot of speed early. He closed in the Withers and he was closing in the Wood Memorial, although he hung like a chandelier, and then also decided to lay all over Lord Miles and did Dreamlike in the stretch of the Wood Memorial. But he's also in post one, and he's going to have all the horses collapse on top of him. So he's going to have to be at best third last, very likely second to last, or even last. So he has a very uphill climb, and there's not going to be any Georgia barbecues this year in the Kentucky Derby. I'm going to say that phrase several times this year. Of course, if you remember, that's what I called the pace meltdown that we were projecting last year. And of course, we're not projecting a pace meltdown this year. So pretty easy pass. Hit Show has the one post handicap, and then also closing in a Kentucky Derby that doesn't seem like it's going to be very advantageous to a horse coming from that very, very far last trip, like Rich Strike was last year.
He's a horse who I think has a big positive of he'll be able to sit a very good, he'll be able to sit a good trip, but won't be able to take advantage of horses backing up into him, and that will probably become a recurring theme with some horses we talk about. I think he'll be picking up ground late purely because he's bred to go this far and beyond. I think there's a reason that the Withers was the first race on the prep schedule, and there's a reason he handled it so well. And obviously, a wide, tough, bounced around trip in the Wood Memorial compromised his chances of really doing his best in there. But I do all in all agree that there is a lack of talent, and that kind of showed early on in his career when he lost that allowance race to Rocket Cannon Confidence game early on. And then regardless with that trip, you should have been able to beat a field as weak as the Wood Memorial, which we'll talk about when we get to Lord Miles more in depth. But he has some really intriguing qualities, the biggest of which is he'll appreciate the distance, but that is mitigated by the talent. And Jack, like you led off with, that inside draw.
And now we're going to move on to the number 2 horse, and that's Verifying for Brad Cox, one of his 3 that he brings to this Kentucky Derby. And he's a horse that I was very intrigued in throughout the course of the past throughout the past 10 days or so. And he's a horse that I thought was very dependent on the draw for how I would view him, but not for himself specifically as a result to other horses. But I'm going to make the case that Verifying can win the Kentucky Derby, and then I'm also going to make the case why I will be against him in this Kentucky Derby. So if you're a figure person, you obviously love Verifying because he has some of the best figures in this race. His allowance win to start off the 2023 season at Oaklawn was a very good race. He had some problems in the Rebel, traffic issues. It was a slight downgrade, but it's a race that you can very easily forgive him for. Then he ran a very, very strong second behind Tapit Trice, who's another horse that on talent is a very good racehorse in the Bluegrass. And Verifying is going to be towards the front end of this race, and he's one that I could very easily see Tyler Gaffalione get somewhat aggressive on, and if they get to a position where he'll be able to get the shortest run around the racetrack throughout the first 3 quarters of this race. And I don't think that they're going to be going overly fast here. So he's a horse that I think is going to last quite a bit if he gets to the stretch. And like I said, occupying that shortest way around the track. I don't think the 2 post is a deficit to him. Some folks might think it is. I'm not really that concerned by it. So certainly the positives, he's got the figures to back himself up. And he's also, even though he was beaten by Tapit Trice, he's going to be a lot more forwardly placed than Tapit Trice. And Tapit Trice is a horse that takes a while to get going, and in the Kentucky Derby, Tapit Trice could get held in going into the stretch. So if you really like Verifying, and you probably also have to really like Tapit Trice, but the way that Verifying is going to win the Kentucky Derby is if he and Tapit Trice are the two best horses in the Kentucky Derby on talent, and Verifying just lost him on the spot in the Bluegrass, but Verifying will win the Kentucky Derby if he gets the trip the best possible trip that I think he could get, and Tapit Trice gets held in. However, I do think that the speed figures are a little bit deceiving with Verifying because he didn't really have an excuse to lose the Bluegrass. He had the perfect trip. Tapit Trice was a little bit wider than him, and Tapit Trice still won the Bluegrass anyway. And Eric brought up a statistic to me last week, which was something that was very concerning to me. But that being said, I give Verifying his credit and I respect him, and I laid out the scenario in which he wins the Kentucky Derby. And it's if you take the viewpoint that him and Tapit Trice are the two best horses in the crop, and Verifying will undoubtedly get a better trip than Tapit Trice will from the position that he will have in this race. But I think that I just don't think that he's going to be, I don't think that he is as good as the speed figures might suggest. He's a nice 3-year-old, but I just don't think the Kentucky Derby is going to be his race.
Yeah, obviously this is a horse with a lot of talent. He's shown it on many occasions throughout his career, but I just feel like these types of horses have come into the Kentucky Derby before, and given the perception that you kind of laid out, Jack, that, this horse can win because of, they have these various intriguing qualities. They have the talent. They just ran a huge prep. And then come Derby time, we just learn, they got the perfect trip in. They're good, but they're not Kentucky Derby winner good. I think it's kind of eerie that there's two horses that in the last 5 years that are very easy to draw parallels to. Flame Away, who was the runner-up in the 2018 Bluegrass, it's had a very similar trip to the one Verifying will likely sit in this year's Kentucky Derby. Then Highly Motivated back in 2021, maybe more so for the Bluegrass run itself, more so than how his Derby went. But for Highly Motivated, if you remember, he also got the perfect trip. That year's Bluegrass in 2021 was littered with closers, including the favorite Essential Quality, maybe not as much as a closer, but not the pace type. And Highly Motivated was able to sit the close trip, got away in the stretch, but then was run down by a better horse on the day. Isn't that kind of what just happened with Verifying? He's got the perfect trip off of a slow pace, made the lead when it mattered, and then was unable to kick away from Tapit Trice. I thought it was a very impressive performance, but if you're going to win a race like the Kentucky Derby, you need to be able to put a horse like that away. I don't think that Tapit Trice getting a worse trip in the Kentucky Derby and Verifying getting another perfect trip in this race will mitigate all the other horses around him who are just as good, who are also stalkers, because he hasn't really proven he's that good of a horse yet. He only has a maiden win and an allowance win. And while he ran well in the Bluegrass, there's also rough performances as a 2-year-old in the Rebel, which he had trouble in, sure, but nevertheless was still kind of finishing evenly. And, he's had, honestly, a similar trip in the Rebel to what he could sit in the Kentucky Derby on the rail behind the leaders. Who's to say a horse will back up to him and, cause him to lose the Derby? Point is, it's easy to figure out a way to see this horse winning, but there's as many, if not more, reasons to say he's probably just a cut below the competition here. He just does not know how to put those wins together yet.
And now we're going to move on to the number 3 horse in this race, and that is Two Phil's, winner of the Jeff Ruby Stakes at Turfway. And that was a very good performance for him at Turfway. Moved him up quite a bit in terms of the speed figures. This is the best horse in the Kentucky Derby on the last out speed figure. And it was certainly an eye-catching performance for him. But this is a horse that you have to answer the perennial question, how are they going to handle getting back to the regular surface? Now, in Two Phil's case, he has a couple of other effort. He has more efforts on dirt than your typical Jeff Ruby Stakes winner would have. This isn't a horse that did all of his running at Turfway or was a turf horse and then just got into the Derby because of a good run or a good placing in the Ruby. He did plenty of dirt running, but this is a horse that lacks a true A effort on a fast dirt track. And if you were able to catch my Kentucky Derby profile that I did about him, that was one of the cons that I had about Two Phil's. Sure, the Ruby was great, but he doesn't have the effort on a fast dirt track. His second best, or his other best career effort was in the street sense at Churchill, which is a positive. I like that Two Phils has experience at Churchill Downs, but that was when it was a wet track. And this is a horse that, in his two efforts at the fairgrounds on fast dirt tracks, he was beaten on the spot by Instant Coffee, who I think is a nice 3-year-old but is not here, and then Angel of Empire, who's one of the favorites for this race. And the excuse there, I guess that the thing that was pointed to as a reason why he lost a couple of those races was he made the move, he made the lead early at about the halfway point in the stretch, and eventually got run by Instant Coffee, and then in the Risen Star, Sun Thunder and Angel of Empire, or flip those if you want to get the respective order of finish that they had there. And then he obviously moved up in terms of figures and metrics with his win in the Jeff Ruby, and I wonder if that was a horse that was really excelling moving to a surface. He's on a hard spun, a horse that obviously had two of his best races on the all-weather stuff at Turfway in the, what was then the Lane's End, obviously now the Jeff Ruby, and then the Kentucky Cup Classic. I wonder if that's something that he's had to, that might have moved him up there. And it's just, my biggest thing against Two Phils is he's just kind of average around where the rest of the crop is in efforts on fast dirt tracks. And he was beaten by Angel of Empire, beaten by Instant Coffee, and also beaten by Sun Thunder in the races at the fairgrounds. So for that reason, those reasons, I'm against Two Phils in this race.
Yeah, and I think another thing about the Ruby is that the quality competition just wasn't that strong. So it was a big win. Impressive time, big figure. The horses he beat are running in the American turf, and while they might run well there, it's not an indication of how you'll run on dirt against Kentucky Derby horses. I really do think synthetic is his best surface. That's why I like him so much in the Ruby, is because in addition to having the talent, he also is by a winner of the, formerly named Lane's End Stakes, now the Jeff Ruby, out of a General Quarters, won the one graded stakes on synthetic in the turf, right? I think that's another factor. Pedigree-wise, makes a lot of sense. He's a very capable dirt horse, but he's probably not as good as that last effort. And then, Jack, as you were saying, those dirt efforts are very middle of the road when you compare it to the competition. I think the Risen Star maybe had the excuse because he made a very early move into a swift pace and ultimately got passed by deeper closers. But the Lecomte, he sat the trip, in my opinion. There was really no reason for him to not stick with Instant Coffee, who you mentioned you hold in high regard. I also hold in high regard. But even then, Instant Coffee wasn't able to succeed in the Louisiana Derby on his own talent. So, it was a very much a circumstantial win last time. It was a dominant one. But it is tough to consider that you have to downgrade the performance because of all of his intangibles on that surface. I also am not a big fan of the draw because he tends to sit back third of the field, and I just don't think from post 3 it's going to be easy for him to navigate through that kind of adversity. Now, he is a winner over this track when he won it in that just absolute downpour in the street sense. So we know we can take dirt at an effective rate, but working on a trip in a 20-horse field from the 3-hole from that far off the pace could really be tough. I mean, it'll take a lot for Jareth Lovebury riding his first Kentucky Derby to get that done.
And now we're going to move on to Confidence Game, one of the very interesting horses coming into this Kentucky Derby. And Confidence Game is going to try to do something that is going to try to break a couple records in the Kentucky Derby. And the first one is not winning the Kentucky Derby without a start in the 9 weeks leading up to the Kentucky Derby. The record right now is 6 weeks, which was between the then Spiral Stakes, which was won by Animal Kingdom on road to his Kentucky Derby win in 2011. And then also Confidence Game breaks a major rule of mine, and that's I don't like horses who don't have a start at a 1 1/8 or further going into a Kentucky Derby. And Confidence Game does not have that. He has a lot of experience at the 1 1/16 trip. Rebel Lecomte, he won an allowance on the Stars of Tomorrow card at Churchill Downs, which was a very salty allowance in which he beat Rocket Can and Hit Show amongst other horses that at the allowance company are nice enough. And I would think that if he had a start between the Rebel and this Kentucky Derby, he'd be a horse that I'd give a lot of thought to, because he does have some nice races to him and some good back class. Obviously, he beat Reincarnate in the Rebel, beat Red Route 1, who was a next out stakes winner, verifying, those horses. He was behind in the Lecomte, Two Fills and Instant Coffee, but those are horses that have quality to them. So some decent back class to him, and I think he improved from the Lecomte into the Rebel, but it's just so unorthodox what he's going to do. It's if you can overlook the things that are going against him, then go for it, because Confidence Game has some good abilities, but I can't take a horse off of a 9-week layoff coming out of a 1.1/16 as his last prep race with no starts at a 1.125. He just is not for me in this race.
Yeah, I mean, experience matters. We talk about that so much on this Derby trail. While he does have 5 straight runs at a 1.1/16, that does not make up for the lack of 1.125 or further experience that so many of his peers have. And you mentioned that you don't like those horses, and that's where the last horse to win the Kentucky Derby, coming off of a 1.1/16 start, was Charismatic back in 1999. So we're talking almost 24 years now since that, and that was a very big long shot in the process. And he was coming off of 2 or 3 week turnaround compared to Confidence Game's 10-week turnaround. So not only are you asking him to improve in distance, for a long and a half in general, you're asking him to do it off a big break where sure, he's been worked consistently to this point, but works do not account for race experience. Even if you do work him a mile from the gate in 1:38, it just doesn't equate. But the Rebel was a big win. You beat Reincarnate in the process, who's a horse that a lot of people are liking in this Derby, and we'll touch on that. Why, and even verifying, of course, being in that race. But when you give your horse as much time, it's just so unseen. Now, Keith DeSormo is the kind of guy to do it. He's very radical in his style, buying, training, racing. It's all very different. So there is that factor too. But there's just so much unknown and so much against the grain going here to really think he can make the move. One thing I do want to mention too before we move on to our next horse is that there is a chance he sits more forward in the Rebel, and I think people need to take that into consideration. You look at his allowance win back in November over this course, the Lecomte, where he was pretty close up. Coming off the bench, you have to think he'd be pretty fresh and more involved in the opening stages of the race. So be on the lookout for that. If you're drawing this up, I could easily see him within 3 or 4 lengths of the lead in the opening stages.
And now we're going to move on to the number 5 horse, and that's Tapit Trice, the second choice in this Kentucky Derby, and a horse that I was considering going with for a very long time. And I mentioned it with verifying because Tapit Trice is coming out of one of the best last out preps in the Bluegrass, and he's just done everything right in his career. Now, he made his first start at Aqueduct on November 6th. He wasn't ready for that, but has since then rattled off 4 straight wins, and he's been getting better with each start. He won an allowance on Holy Bull Day, which was significantly better than the horses that ran in the Holy Bull. Then he went to Tampa. He won that race, and a lot of people complained about the speed figure. There was a lot of gnashing of teeth about that, and we kind of talked about how we didn't really care that the speed figure was all that high in there, that he was a nice racehorse, and then all of it seemed to disappear when he moved up to the Bluegrass, got the big figure that he put up in there, won the race, and all that whole 9 yards, and now is the second choice in this year's Kentucky Derby. And he makes a lot of sense in so many ways in this Kentucky Derby, but we kind of talked about how muddy the potential pace scenario is, and this is a horse that is probably going to be a little bit further back, on the further back side. Now, he was a dead closer in the Tampa Bay Derby. Luis Saez was able to get a little bit more tactical with him in the Bluegrass because there wasn't really that much early foot on in the Bluegrass. There will be more early foot in the Kentucky Derby, which will keep Tapit Trice in that back third of this Kentucky Derby field. And I don't think that this is a great draw for Tapit Trice the 5. I was hoping that he would draw a little bit further out. I talked about how I think that this is a horse that needs to be further outside, not get stuck in traffic, because it takes him a long time to get going, and that's certainly something that I'm concerned about with him having the 5 post. So, and he'll be coming from probably 5th or 6th last in this race. Now, Luis Saez is a capable rider in the Kentucky Derby, and I think that he will be able to work out the trip. But this is just a horse that I think is kind of going to run the typical Pletcher horse that's bred to get the 1.5-mile race, that can do the 1.25 mile, but everyone's going to pick him to win. Everyone's picking him to win the Belmont even before the race, and it's difficult to disagree with anybody doing that, because this is what Todd Pletcher does with these types of horses. I'm not going to call him a plotter, but he's a grinder type horse. 1.25 miles, he may be able to get it, but he's probably going to run that good 5th or 6th place effort and then go right to the Belmont and be the 2-1 favorite to win that race. That's just what it seems like with Tapit Trice, and I just don't think he's going to get the pace in that he needs in front of him to ultimately win this race.
That's exactly it. I think that this is totally a setup casualty to winning this year's Derby. He's going to be coming late, but I don't think anyone's going to be stopping for him. And in reality, obviously the Bluegrass is the exception, but his 3 wins before that from off the pace set up fairly nicely for him. The Bluegrass did not, but Saez was able to work out a great trip on him. That is not also possible, in my opinion, in a 20-horse field. I don't think you're going to be able to make a big drastic middle move, swing to the outside, and then progress throughout the race in a race like the Kentucky Derby. Maybe the Bluegrass, even though it was against 11, it's just a lot more conceivable to do. Now, if Luis Saez is able to work this horse outside by the time they reach the first turn and then progress up the backside, there could be a chance, but then you have to wonder how much horse are you really going to have heading into the stretch. You mentioned the Belmont check. He can run all day, but when you're expending that much energy in the first, 5.5, 6 furlongs of a race, it's fair to say for the next 4 or 4.5, you won't have a ton left. So it's going to be on Luis Saez to get this horse home. I just don't think he's going to. If Tapit Trice is able to win in that fashion, we're going to be talking about a really serious racehorse. Is probably the best way to put it. He's very talented. It's just there won't be enough horses coming back to him to catch him all down the stretch.
And now we're going to move on to the number 6 horse in this Kentucky Derby, the second of 3 in here for trainer Todd Pletcher, and that's Tapit Trice is the last horse. It's been a long day for me, folks. What can I say? Number 6, Kingsbarns, winner of the Louisiana Derby, and the only undefeated horse going into this year's Kentucky Derby, and he breaks a couple of major rules for me. If you remember back to last year, I am one of the old-timey people who still thinks that starts and experience matter going into the Kentucky Derby. And what is this horse? A typical example of a horse that gets started early in their 3-year-old campaign, doesn't have a start at 2, jumps into a stakes race, gets the points to get into the Kentucky Derby, and because he is rather light on seasoning but has some good, impressive wins, people jump onto him. This was Charge It last year, even though Charge It didn't win the Florida Derby. Everybody loved Charge It going into the Kentucky Derby. Now, not everybody, because Charge It was 18-1 or something like that, but there were a lot of people who liked Charge It, and there were a lot of people who liked Kingsbarns, and because Kingsbarns won the Louisiana Derby, he's going to get a lot more backing than even Charge It did. But I'm going to point out the statistic. Horses that have not started, did not start at 2. Yes, Justify won the Kentucky Derby. I understand that. But horses that did not run at 2 since 1937 are 71 horses have run in the Kentucky Derby without a start at 2 since 1937. 1 win, 3 seconds, and 5/3. That is a very poor record, and last year in the Kentucky Derby, there were 4 horses that didn't start at 2 that ran in the Kentucky Derby, and none of them finished better than 10th. He also has only 3 starts going into the Kentucky Derby, and there are only 3 horses ever in the history of the Kentucky Derby that have won the Derby with 3 lifetime starts. 3 horses since the turn of the century, because there was a horse that had won the Kentucky Derby with 2 lifetime starts in 1833. But those 3 horses are Regret, Big Brown, and Justify. Now, I'm going to get Regret out of the way because Regret was in what I call ancient times and not really relevant. But what were the other two horses? Big Brown and Justify. Justify, Triple Crown winner. Big Brown in his crop was a Triple Crown winner in terms of ability. Unless, and this is what I said last year when it came in respect to Taba, and I'm going to rephrase this a little bit, but unless Kingsbarns is a bona fide Triple Crown winner and all of that, he is not going to win the Kentucky Derby this year because experience is important. I just laid it out to you. And last year, there were two horses in the Kentucky Derby with 3 lifetime starts. Those were Charge It and Zozos. Zozos was 10th, Charge It was 13th, Taba was 12th, and I also mentioned the 4th horse that did not start at 2, who I am losing track of right now, Happy Jack, who had 4 starts going into the Kentucky Derby. He was 14th. So the record is very bad for these kind of horses. And then that's not even to mention that Kingsbarns tripped out in the Louisiana Derby. The big positive that I will say for him is he did get to move up in trip in the Louisiana Derby. And I love the Louisiana Derby, the mile and 3/16 as a prep for the Kentucky Derby. But the big issue with Kingsbarns is the lack of experience, and that's the big reason why I'm against him. And I will say it again, unless he is a bona fide Triple Crown winner, he is not going to win the Kentucky Derby because that it matters. And folks disagree with me on it, and I will, every single year, I will harp on this because the data speaks for itself. And you can say, okay, well, it's not the lack of starts that beats them or something like that. They lose because of other factors. It's something that's important. Just look at the data. Since Justify, no horse without a start at 2 has run better than 10th in the Kentucky Derby. And there have been 7 horses that have run in May Kentucky Derbies, and then an 8th if you want to include money moves from the COVID Derby. So it's important. It's something that I will continue to bring up because it might be the main thing that I have against Kingsbarns. He also, I will mention, he's also not the greatest horse on speed figures. If you're a big speed figure person, this horse doesn't check that box for you. But it's my thing every year with the Derby. I harp on it, and I'm going to harp on it with Kingsbarns.
Yeah, very valid points you raised. I mean, we can't discredit the horse. He is very talented. He's a future Grade 1 winner, in my opinion. I think the Derby just comes up a little too soon, and you have to have experience to win this race. And I think people are kind of realizing it. He was 12-1 on the morning line. I think by post time he'll probably rise up to 20-1. And even Todd Fletcher kind of sounds like this is not a horse he, I wouldn't say doesn't think he'll win the Derby, but I think he has better bullets to fire in this year's race. So he's got a lot of talent, just needs to, needed some more seasoning to get fully prepped up for this. I also think, you can look at him being on the lead last time. He can rate well from off the pace. He did it in his first 2 starts really nicely, and he'll have to here. He'll get the right trip. It's just will he be able to overcome it? I mean, he's a very talented runner. It's just, he hasn't been punched in the mouth enough for it to really matter come Derby time.
And now we're going to move on to horse number 7, and that's Reincarnate, a horse who I did not like at all throughout the course of the Kentucky Derby Trail, and then entered today thinking that he might be my win pick for the Kentucky Derby. He's not going to be, but I'm going to tell you why I thought he would, and you can kind of already see why. We're projecting that he's going to be in front, and what happened 2 years ago and 3 years ago? Bob Baffert and Johnny Velasquez won Kentucky Derbies that didn't have, or that eventually on the day, horses either, there wasn't, the speed horses didn't run in the Kentucky Derby, or the speed horses didn't contest the lead, and Johnny Velasquez went out there, seized it, and didn't look back. He did that with Authentic. He did that with Medina Spirit. And I think it is logical to think that that can happen with Reincarnate because he fits that bill, especially of a horse coming out of a prep race where he was not in front. And he also fits that bill. Eric, you talked about him in your preview of him as that horse that sits the doesn't like to pass horses, but doesn't like to pass horses, but doesn't like being passed mold of a racehorse. But there's a major but that I'm going to bring up, and it is the reason why I'm not picking Reincarnate. As dangerous as I think he will be, and as afraid as I am going against him in this Kentucky Derby, because I think it is very possible for this to happen. I said this last year and I gave this warning to folks about Messier going into the Kentucky Derby. Don't look at Medina Spirit and specifically try to apply it to this horse in here, because Messier was not going to be Medina Spirit. Don't overcompensate because you missed out on Medina Spirit in 2021. And that's what I reminded myself when I was thinking about Reincarnate. And what was the big thing that, and this is a question, you might ask, well, what was the thing that pushed you off of Reincarnate? And it was the sham. And it was the sham compared to Medina Spirit's Bob Lewis. Medina Spirit beat real horses in the Bob Lewis. He beat Roman Centurion and Hot Rod Charlie. Now, Roman Centurion never got the opportunity to reach his full potential, but Roman Centurion was a very serious 3-year-old in 2021, and Hot Rod Charlie needs no introduction. So those were real horses. Who did Reincarnates win in the sham came against? Well, it came in a Bob Baffert Invitational where he beat National Treasure. National Treasure was third, and National Treasure was well beaten in the Santa Anita Derby, and then Newgate, who was earned a super inflated and super fake high speed figure in the Bob Lewis, but it was a Bob Baffert Invitational. There were 5 horses in that race. Spun Intended pulled up, and Paxawallop was a turf horse who was beaten 23 lengths, and the rest of the 3 horses were Bob Baffert horses. Reincarnate ran in a fake sham, got a good figure in it, and some people might bring up the fact that he has regressed in figures. Again, I think the sham was a fake figure. We talked about it last year. We talked about it last year. Our thoughts on the California speed figures, those are still very much the case this year. But as I said, Reincarnate, I'm scared that he can go to the front and try to steal it the whole way. But the difference between him and Medina Spirit is Medina Spirit beat talented quality racehorses, and Reincarnate just has not.
Yeah, I mean, the case can be made that he can go and wire this field, but I don't think that happens. I mentioned earlier, Jace's road is probably just a touch quicker early on, and he's going to force this horse to work hard. He's not a naturally fast horse either. I mean, he made the lead in the sham, and the pace was hot, but I think his last 2 races are better indications of what he can really do, and it's not be the quickest away. In the Arkansas Derby, he was a touch slow away from the gates. He just happened to have no one outside of him, so he was able to rush up nicely and sit that really good pressing trip. But he also wasn't able to take advantage of it and kind of sputtered down the lane. I mean, he's ran 2 good races in Arkansas, but he's also regressed. If you're looking at the figures, he threw a 95 in the sham, down to a 90 in the Rebel, and then an 86 in the Arkansas Derby, which is one of the worst last out figures on buyer standards in the field. And that kind of is, that sentiment's held true, I should say, when you look at the other metrics as well. So Reincarnate, he's done good work, but he really has not proven much, and he's also lost to Angel of Empire confidence gave, and then even also eligible King Russell in his last few races. I will say he can run all day. The distance isn't what's going to kill him. They've back in January, Bob Baffert was saying this is his Belmont horse. I could easily see that being the case. I just don't think the talent is there. And Jack, you were kind of saying that when you were comparing him to the Medina Spirit. You can draw the comparisons, but you still have to be as talented of a horse. And he's just not as good as Medina Spirit or Authentic were coming into their Kentucky Derbies.
And now we're going to move on to the number 8 horse in this race, and that's Mage, the other horse that is coming into this Kentucky Derby with 3 starts and did not have any starts as a 2-year-old. And pretty much I'm going to say the same thing about Mage that I said about Kingsbarns, but I'm not going to rehash it. But it's even more magnified with Mage because Mage is coming in here with a maiden victory, and then he was just able to pick up his points in a Kentucky Derby, with a placing in a Kentucky Derby prep race. Might be a decent enough 3-year-old. He ran a good race in the Florida Derby to run second. Looked like at the 16th pole he had Forte beat. Now, in his start 2 back in the Fountain of Youth, he was well backed in there. Kind of hit the gate and went wrong there. Had a bunch of stuff go wrong in that race. So you can kind of forgive him for that effort, but he was also on 2 occasions beaten on the spot by Forte, and even much more so in the Florida Derby. He had every reason to beat Forte, and Forte was still able to get by him. So there's that plus the fact that he is coming into this race extremely light on experience. I would even say that I think that the lack of experience is more of a problem for him than it is for Kingsbarns, and you heard how much of a problem I think it is for Kingsbarns, so I would only magnify that with Mage. So, nice 3-year-old, but I think he's in over his head in this Kentucky Derby, and he's an easy pass for me.
Definitely another case of too much too soon. Really only him and Kingsbarns equate to that in this year's Derby, which is kind of nice to see after a few Derbies that had quite a few lightly raced runners. But for Mage, he's another one with a lot of talent, but the fountain of youth, I felt like, really kind of exemplified the inexperience. The Florida Derby was a huge effort, but it also set up nicely for him to make that move. You do have to love the versatility. I will say he has been punched in the mouth, whereas Kingsbarns has not. But it's still the fact you had all those troubles. You weren't able to beat Forte, and then two back weren't able to beat Forte, Rocky Cain, Cyclone, Mischief. What's to say you can beat 20 horses or 19 other horses in a Kentucky Derby?
And now we're going to move on to the number 9 horse in this race, and that is Skinner for John Sheriffs and the CRK Stable Group. These are the folks who brought Honor AP to the Kentucky Derby a few years ago in 2020. And I think Skinner is another one of those horses that fits that type. A lot of people like Skinner going into this Kentucky Derby, including our friend Jay Privman, who we did speak to, and we will have it in some fashion on Racing Rundown here. I'll get more into that when we get to this week's episode of Racing Rundown. But Jay likes Skinner. A lot of people like Skinner. We don't like Skinner. Why don't we like Skinner, Eric?
I mean, he doesn't know how to win. 1 for 6 lifetime. He was unable to finish the job in the Santa Anita Derby, and I feel like that's the race. That's the race. And I don't want to take too much away from you, Jack, but the pace set up perfectly for him. It was a shorter field, only 7 rivals, 8 horses in total. They come from last, 46-3. You're wide, but you're only 3 to 4 wide. You're there at the top of the stretch, and then you just wait on Practical Move and Commander and Hero the entire length of the stretch. It's not like you needed more distance or anything. He just likes to wait on horses, and then his only win came in a weak maiden race. I mean, look at last weekend alone. Some of the horses that he beat in that maiden special weight lost again for like the second or third time since losing to Skinner. So he didn't beat a good group. He's only lost to, as a 2-year-old, didn't lose to any Derby contenders. This year has lost to some okay horses, actually. But he was not able to go by them. And then finally the pace just doesn't set up for him in the slightest. So I really just do not see what everyone's liking, except for those pesky little buyer speed figures.
The speed figures, and then also, there are the horses that, and I look for this too, but the horses that place in Kentucky Derby prep races going shorter and then get an opportunity to move up, and everybody's always trying to look for that price horse, and we're going to do the same, but Skinner is certainly not going to be that horse for me in this Kentucky Derby. And you point to the Santa Anita Derby, and sure, he was 3rd in there, but he got a relatively good trip, as Eric mentioned, and he's going to have to be significantly wider in this year's Kentucky Derby, and he only does have the 1 victory in the maiden race. You go back to the American Pharoah when he was a 2-year-old, which was against Grade 1 competition. He was beaten very much by Cave Rock, National Treasure, and Hijazi, who, National Treasure and Hijazi are horses that I know some people like more so than I do. I don't really like either of them. And all in all, Skinner, one of the things that I always say the week of the Kentucky Derby is everybody else's wise guy horse is not my wise guy horse. And I think that this is the horse that everybody's going to point to the placings underneath in prep races, moving up in 1.25 miles. I think this is going to be the horse that everybody's going to say he's either going to win or he's going to run a really good race underneath, and you got to bet him. And I think that he's going to be the horse that overall is going to be the majority choice on that front. He's not the only horse that can fit that bill, but I think that he's going to be one of those horses that folks are going to try to do that with. And I just don't think it's going to. I don't think he can't run a Honor AP type 4th or 5th in this Kentucky Derby, but I don't think he's a win contender, and I like other horses. As I say, I always look first and foremost for the value with the horse, then for their ability to actually place. And we'll talk about that with some of the other horses. And I just don't think that the value is going to be there for Skinner. And then I also think that there are horses that are a little bit better than him. Now, I can't say that he's not, or I can't completely discount the opportunity for him to place in this Derby, because he is going to be that type of closer horse that I generally do like to look for. But again, I think that there are better horses than Skinner that fit that bill. We'll move on to the number 10 horse, Practical Move, who won that Santa Anita Derby that we were just talking about with Skinner. And Practical Move is a horse that has won 3 straight really nice races. He won the Los Al Futurity, which I'm very shocked that the Los Al Futurity is actually producing a legitimate Kentucky Derby horse for the first time, I think, since 2019. So congrats to that race. But he won that race in good fashion. Then he moved up very well in the San Felipe. And the San Felipe was maybe a career best effort for him, where he finished in front, 2.5 lengths in front of Go Rocket Ride. Good horse, already mentioned Skinner, and then Hijazi, who was second in the Lexington behind First Mission. And if you're a buyer speed figure person, he's got the 200s, and then the horses underneath him certainly check out in terms of that front where they did their running. And he's also a horse that's tried and true at 2 turns. And a lot of people say this horse is distance limited. I don't really think so, because all of his wins have come at 2 turns. He lost the Bob Hope at Del Mar, where he was beaten by Having a Meltdown, who is a nice 3-year-old sprinter, and then Newgate, which I don't really know why he lost to Newgate there, but that's completely beside the point. His wins have all been at 2 turns, a mile at Santa Anita, and then the mile and a 16th, and the 2 mile and a 16th trips, and then the mile and an 8th in the Santa Anita Derby. And he's also a horse that he's not one that doesn't like to pass horses, but he doesn't like to let horses past him. He was in that stretch battle, getting punched in the mouth the entire way, to steal Eric's phrase, by Mandarin Hero, didn't let him pass, won the race by a nose. It was a very good win for him there, sets him up very well for this Kentucky Derby. I think he makes a lot of sense because he does several important things. Number 1, he wins. Number 2, he's faced adversity. And then also, if you love your speed figures, this is the best consistent horse on terms of speed figures. And what I mean by that is he put up back-to-back triple-digit efforts, and his triple-digit effort isn't coming in a race on a different surface like Two Phil's is. So that's what I mean when I say the best consistent horse on the speed figure scale. So I think there's a lot of reasons to like Practical Move in this year's Kentucky Derby.
Yeah, you laid it out very well there, Jack. This is a horse who has done a lot of good out west. I think the biggest knock is that there aren't many horses that he's facing that also have Kentucky Derby, that are also in the Kentucky Derby, and for that matter, have merits. Obviously, Skinner still shows up and, kind of last second and is here. But even then, we mentioned it, kind of a couple low, and then Mandarin Hero stuck on the also eligible list. We'll see what that ends up becoming. But regardless, he was visually dominant in the Los Al Futurity in the San Felipe. And I feel like not enough people are looking at the fact that in the Santa Anita Derby, he made a pretty swift middle move into a hot pace, and that could have compromised him very much. But he dug in, he held off Mandarin Hero and Skinner, and was able to get the job done. I don't think you can look at that and say, oh, he's distance limited, because it was actually him just being more a victim of the tactics of the race there. But he finished off the San Felipe and Los Al Futurity very strong. And pedigree-wise, Practical Joke might be okay with, he does well with sprinters, sure, but he himself was a good 2-turn horse, and he has a 2-turn pedigree. He's brought on the same cross as Authentic was. On the dam side, he's out of a Fleet Alex mare, so there's obviously a ton of stamina infused through that. All in all, just a lot of good qualities. I think the class is the biggest thing he'll have to answer, but I think so many of these other horses have to answer that as well.
And now we're going to move on to the number 11 horse in this year's Kentucky Derby, and that is Disarm for trainer Steve Asmussen and Ron Winchell. These are the folks who obviously had their hearts broken by Rich Strike with Epicenter last year. They're coming back for another go and a try at a first Kentucky Derby win, and Disarm is a very intriguing type. Now, he's a horse that has some of the same pitfalls as Skinner, has only won at the maiden special weight level, but he has more upside, I think, than Skinner. So first of all, broke his maiden in August of last year at Saratoga. Hasn't won since then, but got a long break, and I think that break allowed him to grow into himself and to become a very fine 2-year-old. So he didn't get to run in the stakes until the Louisiana Derby. He ran in an allowance at Oaklawn where he lost to a horse named Two Eagles River, who I think is a decent enough horse going around one turn, and Two Eagles River kind of tripped out in that race. And Disarm is a horse he's by Gun Runner out of a Tapit mare. That's 2 turns all the way, so a mile certainly short for him, and also lost to a horse who tripped out there. Then he got to run in the Louisiana Derby. I love the Louisiana Derby, especially the mile and 3/16 Louisiana Derby as of late, as a prep into the Kentucky Derby. In the last 2 derbies, the winner of it, the winner of the Louisiana Derbies, Hot Rod Charlie and Epicenter, they both ran, in terms of Hot Rod Charlie, officially second. He was third initially, but with the disqualification moved up to second. And then Epicenter finished the race second. So the winners were both second. Mandaloon, who was unplaced in the 2021 Louisiana Derby, moved up very well into the Kentucky Derby. Midnight Bourbon also placed well in there. And then last year, Epicenter was really the big one from the Louisiana Derby, as Pioneer Medina was kind of over his head in there. But Disarm is a horse that is coming into the Kentucky Derby after really appreciating the move up in trip to the mile and 3/16. But we got to talk about his most recent effort, which was in the Lexington. And unfortunately, because of the quirks of the new point system and his late start, Disarm's second 40 points in the Louisiana Derby, which in every year before this in the point system would have been enough to get him into the Kentucky Derby, was not. So Steve Asmussen had to wheel him back 2 weeks after the Louisiana Derby in Lexington, and the start didn't really go that well for him. He ran third, but again, we talked to Jay Pribbin. I'm going to take something, and I got to give him the credit for this because this is what he said. But he said you can kind of make the case that Disarm's effort in the Louisiana Derby was a means to an end, and that is the specific phrase that he used, means to an end, to get him into the Kentucky Derby. And I think that it's very likely that Steve Asmussen just said, okay, we need to just do enough to get him into the Kentucky Derby, and that was how he was prepped going into the Lexington. And the thought from the Lexington is, okay, he's going to prep there, and then get to the Kentucky Derby, which is going to serve him a lot better than the Lexington did. The Louisiana Derby was a move up in trip, as I mentioned, from that mile to the mile and 3/16. He really appreciated that. Didn't really like the cutback that much. Should be mentioned also, Arabian Lion really tripped out in there. First mission, very nice 3-year-old, will be one of the favored horses going into the Preakness. I think moving back up in trip to the mile and a quarter is going to be perfect for Disarm. And I think the other thing, Disarm was getting wise guide a lot after the Louisiana Derby. I think that the Lexington killed some of that value on him, but I would caution anyone taking the Lexington at face value, because that was a race that was really served to just get him into the Kentucky Derby, and then also you can throw it out because it was a cutback in trip for him. I think moving back up to the mile and a quarter is going to serve him very well, and I think that he makes a lot of sense as a board hitter in this year's Kentucky Derby, and I'm going to put that out there, that he is more than likely going to be the horse that I will select as my long shot type of board hitter that I look for every year in the Kentucky Derby.
Yeah, I mean, you covered a lot of good stuff there. A horse is doing a lot of good work and is improving steadily. You want to see a little bit more of the willingness to win. Obviously, we saw it at Saratoga last year, but not this year. But you're right, it has been a bit more circumstantial. I think that the keys he needs to get out of the gates well. He hasn't always been the best from there, and his early speed has kind of been non-existent as of late. So that's another factor. He's going to be coming from mid-pack for sure. But, if Joel Rosario can keep him involved early, and involved meaning within those 6 legs that I said you probably need to be within in this year's race, he'll have a chance. I think the distance is the biggest thing. He's one who has experience, but I will also kind of group in with needs to be punched in the mouth and know how to respond. Because that's the half of it, right? Anybody can get punched in the mouth. I mean, Skinner got punched in the mouth 5 times in his career and did nothing about it. Other horses, like past Derby winners, Medina Spirit and horses like that, or horses that cross the wire first, authentic horses like that, got punched in the mouth and knew what to do to respond to that adversity. I don't know if Disarm knows how to do that yet. So that's kind of my biggest knock, is that, yeah, he has 5 starts, but it feels like there is an element of experience that he is lacking. But I think he's intriguing, especially at the right price. And Jack, I think you're definitely onto something good there.
And now we're going to move on to the number 12 horse in this race, and that's Jace's Road, who we talked about is the likely pace setter in this race, is one of the likely pace setters in this race. And Jace's Road, I think, is just a cut below. We're going to get to a couple of horses now. Fortunately, we got a lot of the better horses in the first half of the field, and we're going to get to a lot of some of the lesser horses in this year's Kentucky Derby. And I think that that's kind of what Jace's Road is. He's a horse that used the opportunity on the point, or on this Kentucky Derby trail, to pick up some points. Was able to get into the Kentucky Derby off of his 3rd in the Louisiana Derby, and then subsequently Chad Brown taking blazing 7s out of the Kentucky Derby. 3rd in the Louisiana Derby, who sat 2nd off of Kingsbarns, backed up a little bit and was eventually passed by Disarm. There did win the gun runner well, making every yard in it, and he's a horse that it certainly does his best running when he has an opportunity to be alone on the front end. But the gun runner was really a race that lacks any real true talent. Over Raise Cain was a subsequent stakes winner from that race, but not in a circumstance that would bode well for a Kentucky Derby start. And then outside of that, the rest of the gun runner leaves a whole lot to be desired. Well beaten while rating in the Southwest, and again, he backed up toward the end of the Louisiana Derby, and I don't really think a step up a half a furlong in trip from the Louisiana Derby into the Kentucky Derby is going to do him very much good. But if you're someone who believes that the gun runner is absolutely indicative of the type of race that he will run, and you think that being alone on the front end is the only way that can get him to the winner's circle, but is a legitimate way to get him to the winner's circle, go for it, because he's 50 to 1 on the morning line, and he is likely going to be a very long price on Kentucky Derby Saturday.
Yeah, definitely. But, he matters. He's one of the most important horses in this year's Derby because of his pace presence. So that's certainly not something to be disregarding. And, there's 2 speeds in this race. I mean, there's no beating around that. Neither seem good enough to win the Derby, but I feel like you have to consider some of them, one of them underneath in some sense, because they're not going to be backing up unless they somehow really go at it. This horse will be in front, and when he was in front of the gun runner, he did it just fine. Looked like he could run for forever. The last 2 races just didn't go with him. The Southwest, for one, is just a complete line through, because he clearly does not like a sloppy track. So if the rain comes pouring for whatever reason on Saturday, he's a big toss. But his 2 runs on a sloppy track were terrible, easy to draw lines through, and the rest of form becomes a lot prettier. Louisiana, he just didn't make the lead and laid it down. Now, I don't think it's much different this time around, but I'm sure he'll be ridden aggressively, and I'm sure they won't let him go off through the first quarter in this race without trying to be a clear leader. So we'll see what he can do from there. If the referee's going to do his job, I'm sure put him on the lead. It's up to you to decide how long you think he'll stick around. I wouldn't blame anyone for using him deep in the exotics, like a try or a super, on the off chance he goes so slow that no one else is with him. So that's my positive look on Jace's Road, who otherwise has a pretty muddy and unappealing form.
And now we're going to move on to horse number 13, and that is Sun Thunder. And Sun Thunder, I think, is one of 3 horses in this Kentucky Derby that are just kind of here for the party. He was one of those points eaters throughout the Kentucky Derby trail, took advantage of the changes to the point system, was 5th in the Louisiana Derby, picked up 10 points there, wheeled back in a couple of weeks, picked up a 4th in the Bluegrass, does not have a win in the maiden special weight level. He's going to be a massive price. He hits the board. He's hit the board in 3 of 4 Kentucky Derby prep races, but there are horses that are much better than him on ability that are going to be, sure, they might not be 70 to 1 or something like. I think it's likely that Sun Thunder will be around the country house, if not higher price range, but there will be horses that are much better than Sun Thunder on talent that will be still high prices, but much more realistic chances to run well in the Kentucky Derby. So Sun Thunder's a big pass for me. I think he's one of those horses that 8 points on the Kentucky Derby trail and is just kind of here for the party.
Yeah, all in all, I agree with that. in the Risen Star here in a very big race, but that was because the pace packed up so nicely into him. I don't see that being the case this time around, because as we mentioned, there's you have to be within 6 lengths it feels to win this Derby. The Bluegrass Louisiana Derby, he was picking up. He's actually a pretty talented horse, but he's also very dependent on the external circumstances that it doesn't seem like he's going to get in this race. He will have blinkers for the Derby. I do wonder that if that sharpens him up a little bit, and maybe keeps him more involved, in which case, fair game. But based off his running style, I haven't personally seen that, that kind of early speed from him without the blinkers to think even adding him will move him up that much. So I agree with you, Jack, a toss, but a talented horse who just needs the right setup to be the most effective.
And now we're going to move on to horse number 14, and that's Angel of Empire, the third of the 3 Brad Cox horses in this race, and the most highly touted of them. And one thing that I'll say right off the bat about Angel of Empire, and we didn't get to talk about it with Kingsbarns, Pratt rode both of those in their final prep, and Pratt very quickly chose Angel of Empire as the horse that he was going to ride in the Kentucky Derby. So that's certainly an indication that he thinks that Angel of Empire has some really, really good chances in the Kentucky Derby, and Flavien Prat's record in the Kentucky Derby is exceptional. Of course, the win that he had in 2019 when Country House was put up, but also has 2 third place finishes in the Kentucky Derby, or actually, I'm sorry, 3 third place finishes in the Kentucky Derby aboard Battle of Midway, Hot Rod Charlie, and Zandon, and then an effort on Solomini in 2018 where Solomini had no business running as well, where Solomini was a massive long shot, but Pratt was able to get, I think, a good 8th place finish out of him. So I mentioned that the past few years because Flavien Prat is very good at riding at Churchill Downs. Now for Angel of Empire, this is a horse, I talked about it in the Kentucky Oaks preview, started out his career at Horseshoe Indianapolis, and then was second while well beaten behind Victory Formation in the Smarty Jones, but really seemed to catch on in winning the Risen Star and the Arkansas Derby. Now, the Arkansas Derby was a very good visual effort, won by 4 1/4 lengths, and he beat Reincarnate and Rocket Can and 2 horses that are in the Kentucky Derby, and then Red Route 1, who was a next out winner in the Bathhouse Row Stakes, and then also beat 2 Phils, who obviously came back and did his thing beat 2 Phils in the Risen Star, and then I mentioned 2 Phils did his thing. Now, Angel of Empire is a horse that I think he's a good horse, but I'm not quite sure how much better than the mean of this field and then also he's a horse that certainly does his best running towards the back 2/3 of the field in his races, and just as we talked about with the pace scenario here, he's going to be behind Forte, as you saw, and I don't think that that's going to bode very well for him. I think that there's reasons to like him. His Arkansas Derby win was certainly very nice. I wouldn't say to anyone you're crazy for going with him, but Angel of Empire I'm going to pass on in this race just because I do think that there are better horses than him in this Derby.
Yeah, I mean, he's beaten plenty of horses that are going to be running in this race, and that's a huge plus in his corner, but a lot of it's been circumstantial. Both the Risen Star and the Arkansas Derby set up really well for him, and he's delivered 2 great rides, and I'm sure Flavien Prat will be doing everything in his power to do it again. I just don't know if enough horses will be coming back to him. I've said that with a couple. I'm going to keep saying it with these talented off-the-pace types. There's just not going to be obviously a meltdown like last year is pretty hard to envision, but even to like the 75th percent extent of a meltdown would help a horse like Angel of Empire. Well, they're not going to get that here unless someone goes really off the wall. So he's going to be gaining. It's just not going to be enough in my eyes to get by those types. And also, yeah, he does not seem very fast. This is one of those speed figures kind of tell the story because he's consistently slower than his rivals, despite putting up 4 straight good performances in his career. So that's another thing you have to consider. I mean, And also, just how much do you love a Sun Thunder, a King, the two fills, a King Russell, a Reincarnate, and a Rocket Can, right? Um, beating Derby starters, but how good of Derby starters?
And now we're going to move on to the favorite in this year's Kentucky Derby, reigning champion 2-year-old, number 15, Forte. Forte has done everything right leading up into the Kentucky Derby. It feels like an eon ago when he lost the Sanford. And my favorite story about Forte, or my favorite thing to tell people about Forte, is I picked him in the Sanford and then picked against him in 3 straight races. He won all of them en route to a championship. But my moronic picks aside, we'll get into his chances in this year's Kentucky Derby, and he certainly has regressed on a metric standpoint, and that's something that's been made a lot about him in this year's Kentucky Derby. He ran the 100 when he won the Breeders' Cup Juvenile, and then a regression back to a 98 in the Fountain of Youth, and then a 95 in the Florida Derby. So certainly on a buyer standpoint, there are reasons to think, okay, is the rest of the pack catching up to Forte? But at the same time, Forte just knows how to win, and to once again use Eric's phrase, he's been punched in the mouth. He knows how to respond, and he knows how to win races. He never look like the winner of the Florida Derby until past the 16th pole when he was able to go by. And then I haven't seen enough people talk about this. Not only did he beat Mage, Pete Aiello, the race call, and I really don't like to pull lines from race calls that much because sometimes they don't really matter. And I'm not using this as a critique of Pete Aiello because it was logical that Pete was good. Pete said that it was going to be very close, and it's logical for Pete to think that it was going to be a very close finish. It was not. Forte kicked it in that last 50 yards and ended up winning by a comfortable length, very comfortable margin of victory when you consider where he was at the 16th pole. So Forte gets the job done. Another thing that's very important, being from post 15, likely is going to have to be wide. Well, he was wide in the Florida Derby, 5 wide there. He's also wide in the Fountain of Youth, although he did have a much easier trip there in the Fountain of Youth than he did in the Florida Derby, but has been able to be wide before, has overcome things in the past, and just knows how to win. He's also got an experience over and off track. If it somehow or for some reason does pour rain on Kentucky Derby Day, that's something that you can put in Forte's corner, as he has been able to deal with before. Just does a lot of things right. It's difficult to poke holes in Forte. The question is, is he going to... once again, Eric, you've been saying this, and I don't want to steal this from you. Are horses going to come back to him? I think that his Florida Derby effort was very similar to the effort that Essential Quality had 2 years ago in the Bluegrass, and we know how Essential Quality ran in the Kentucky Derby. Very good, but not enough late to be able to get up to win the Kentucky Derby. And Forte might have the same thing, but I think you can draw a lot of parallels to him and Essential Quality. That being said, he knows how to win. He's got 5 straight going into the Kentucky Derby. I certainly value wins, and he's one that it is very difficult. He's hard to beat in this year's Kentucky Derby.
Yeah, he just keeps doing it all right, but I do think he has not really improved from 2 to 3. Now that still could be enough to win a Kentucky Derby because he was so dominant as a 2-year-old, but regardless, I think the figures aren't far off on this. I mean, maybe not from 100 to a 95, big difference, but I don't think he's gotten better, and I don't think he's beaten the best horses. Cyclone Mischief ran 3rd in both his preps, and if he does draw into the Derby as also eligible, he'll be the longest shot on the board. I can be pretty confident saying that. So all things considered, that there is reason to doubt him, but he also just knows how to win. And that was the Essential Quality line, of course, a few years ago from my mouth, for sure, because that's why I picked Essential Quality. He just knows how to win. But Forte, that's certainly his thing. He finishes up well, but he does need to make sure he stays involved early because he had a tendency in the Florida Derby that I didn't love, that he just kind of took himself out of the race. And if he does that here, it could be too much work to do to catch these runaway horses early on. So other than the fact he hasn't improved, I don't think that matters as much as getting the right trip. I think he drew well. I think Irad's going to have to lose some ground at times, but be willing to, but also keep him engaged early on, because if he's not, it's going to cost him dearly.
And now we're going to move on to horse number 16, and that's Raise Cain. And I'm going to be very blunt with Raise Cain. I think objectively Raise Cain is the least talented horse in this year's Kentucky Derby. And I'm going to be completely upfront with that. Raise Cain's only win came in a pace meltdown Gotham on a track that was, it was a still a sloppy track. We had a lot of rain that weekend, and Raise Cain took the opportunity where a loose horse kind of screwed up the early dynamics of the race, blew it up, and he came from fourth last in that race to circle the field, won that, and does not have a great effort outside of, he has a couple of okay efforts. He was third at Keeneland in a race going 7 furlongs, and he was second behind Jace's Road in the Gun Runner, but we already talked about how we feel about Jace's Road. And then the Leonis, he didn't really do much. He ran in the Gotham, obviously won the Gotham, and that's why he's here, but then left a whole lot to be desired in the Bluegrass. I cannot draw a scenario in which Raise Cain wins the Kentucky Derby, and as I said, he is, I think, objectively the least talented horse in this race, and we will move on after Eric. You have your say on him to the next horse in this race.
Yeah, I mean, Raise Cain, I can, there's an excuse for the Bluegrass. The pace was not there for him, like we talked about, in Joel Rosario, who was aboard that day, made no efforts to try and get him more involved until the running got going. So you can draw something from that, but the Derby's going to set up the same way, so it's not like it matters. The Gotham was a good win. It was a very impressive win, but that was also going one turn where he's done his best work. So he does have good attributes. It's not towards, it does not add up towards winning a race like the Kentucky Derby.
And now we're going to move on to number 17. The infamous post number 17 will be occupied by the winner of the UAE Derby, Derma Sotogake, or Derma Sotogake. I don't know which way we're saying that horse's name. I've been doing it both ways, so I'm just going to cover myself there. Winner of the UAE Derby, as I mentioned, Christophe Lemaire comes in to ride. He rode Crown Pride in last year's Kentucky Derby. Now, there's a couple of things that immediately pop out, and that is, of course, the fact that he is in post number 17. No horse has ever won the Kentucky Derby from post 17, but this is only the third Kentucky Derby, and actually I have to correct myself again. This is the fourth Kentucky Derby with the single starting gate era of the Kentucky Derby without the auxiliary gate. So it's not as much of a disadvantage as it would have been for horses in the past. And that also goes for horses that are breaking from traditionally bad posts like Forte and Angel of Empire, who are in 14 and 15. So that's something that I'm not concerned about with Derma Sotogake. This is one of the times, and post 17 the past couple of years has been irrelevant, but certainly with this one, it's not something where you look at and say post 17 is going to beat him. The other big elephant in the room is this is a horse that is coming out of the UAE Derby. The UAE Derby has produced 18 Kentucky Derby starters. The best finish amongst those among any horse coming from the UAE Derby was a 5th place effort, which was put up by Master of Hounds in 2011. And there's been a lot of very, very poor efforts in the UAE Derby. But I want to apply a little bit of context to that. So there were 3 straight horses came from Maidan after wins in the UAE Derby when it was run on Polytrack. And that was, of course, Master of Hounds, who I mentioned, Daddy Longlegs, and Lines of Battle. So I will immediately throw those 3 horses out of consideration when we're talking about the UAE Derby. I will also throw out the horses who were in what were essentially Godolphin Invitational UAE Derbies, which were Karul and China Visit, Express Tour, and Essence of Dubai from 2000, 2001, and 2002, respectively. You can also throw out of here in that also from 2003. I will also throw out the 1-2 finishers from 2009 because those were horses that were, well, not as much of Godolphin Invitationals. Those were horses that were certainly left a lot to be desired. So there are really 3 or 4 horses that I think were actually legitimately talented coming out of the UAE Derby going into their Kentucky Derbies. Those would be Muptahij, Thunder Snow, Mendelssohn, Crown Pride from last year, and then I guess we can group in Lonnie. I don't want to group in the 2 American horses because they were bad. They shipped out. Can toss them. Really can also kind of toss Lonnie because there's not a lot of talent in there. Mendelssohn you can toss because of the fact that the Kentucky Derby came up sloppy. Thunder Snow basically didn't run in the Kentucky Derby. And then last year, Summers Tomorrow had no chance, and Crown Pride was caught up in that pace meltdown. So basically, when you look at the UAE Derby that way, and I'm sorry that I went on that whole tangent there, but I wanted to break this down because the UAE Derby is not going to be the reason that Derma Sotogake loses the Kentucky Derby this year, because most of those horses were either turf horses that got into the Kentucky Derby off of running on polytrack, horses that won Godolphin Invitationals, or horses that were just second rate that used that as an opportunity to get to the Kentucky Derby. Mendelssohn was not that. Thunder Snow we can't really consider because he didn't get an opportunity to run in the Kentucky Derby, but I would also consider Crown Pride as a legitimately talented horse, and Crown Pride was caught up in that pace meltdown in last year's Kentucky Derby. Now, let's get to Derma Sotogake's actual abilities. This is a horse that is coming out of a very, very good win in the UAE Derby. Granted, he did trip out there. And another thing, he's got experience over the trip. I love horses that get a chance to go 1.1 miles and longer. He got the chance to go 1 mile and 3/16. And this is a horse that is very versatile. Now, he made all when he won the UAE Derby, but he's also shown that he can close. And I think Christophe Lemaire, very smart, will be able to dictate his own trip in this year's Kentucky Derby. If Jace's Road or Reincarnate don't go, or things happen and it looks like that they're going to be walking, then I think Christophe Lemaire will take initiative and put Derma Sotogake, if not in front, hip sitting off of one of the other two horses that are making the pace. But if for some reason they do decide to go pretty fast, he can pull off a little bit, because that's what Derma Sotogake has done in some of his past races. And he has some really good wins. He won at Hanshin in Japan back in November of last year over Continuar, who's also in this Kentucky Derby, in a very fine fashion, going 1.1 miles, cut back to 1 mile in his next start, which was in a local grade 1 in Japan. Barely won that race. I don't know how he won it, but it was going 1 mile, and he certainly looked like he wanted more there. Ran in the Saudi Derby, which is a very weird one-turn mile. I tossed that race immediately, and then obviously I picked him in the UAE Derby, and I think that he ran a very, very solid race there. So his versatility, I think, is something that's very important for him. His experience at the trip is also something that I really like about him. I laid out why I don't care about the UAE Derby, and then post 17 isn't as much of an issue now as it is as it would have been before the era of the single starting gate without the auxiliary gate. The negative for Derma Sotogake is if everybody that could potentially send inside of him does decide to send, he might have to be pretty wide if Christophe Lemaire decides that he's going to be forwardly placed. But Christophe Lemaire doesn't have to be, and Derma Sotogake don't have to be forwardly placed, so that's something that I am able to be okay with if he runs, if he does eventually have to rate in this race. So there's a lot of reasons to like Derma Sotogake. I don't care about the UAE Derby, and I think that post 17 is okay.
Yeah, I mean, not much for me to add from this point on, but a horse who obviously is moving in the greatest of directions, comes off a huge win. The UAE Derby was filled with bias. I think we need to remember that inside speed was going to prevail regardless of who was there, and they merry-go-round it around there. But the talent is apparent if you look at his entire body of work on the dirt. Winning 4 of his last 5 and doing so much at these longer distances. One of only 2 horses in the race to win at 1 mile and 3/16, and certainly the more impressive of the 2, the other being Kingsbarns. So he is the complete package. He just has to, prove he can do the ship.
And now we are going to move on to number 18 in this race, and that is Raise Cain, the winner of the Holy Bull, and placed in the Fountain of Youth, and then also ran in the Arkansas Derby. Raise Cain is a horse that I personally don't really like, because I think that the Holy Bull was a rather weak group of horses that he beat, and then he was beaten on a couple of occasions by Forte, where he didn't really have an excuse or a reason to lose to Forte other than Forte was just better. He ran a good second there, but Forte was just better than him on that day. And then also in the Arkansas Derby, Angel of Empire was just better. He was it was a blanket finish for second, third, and fourth there, so was only a short margin of victory, or a short margin off of second there, a half length and ahead away from being second in the Arkansas Derby, but still, it was enough of a defeat for me to say Rocket Can's a horse that I got to take a pass on in here, just because he has a win in a weak prep race, but outside of that, it is very average compared to the rest of this group.
Yeah, I think he's a horse who on resume is a horse that needs to show much improvement in the Kentucky Derby. But there is reason to see him improving, and that's because he will add blinkers in the race. It's something that he's worked in really nicely over the past few weeks now down at Churchill Downs, and that could move him forward. It's a successful angle for Belmont, and this is a horse who it makes sense for. He'd been running lazily in many of his starts. Including the last two, it felt like he was lacking that final punch, and perhaps Belmont is onto something with the addition of blinkers. It's a tough angle to rely on in the Kentucky Derby, but it is a reason to think he could move forward and run a lot better. I think, me personally, I rarely ever take much from the morning workouts leading into the Derby, and Jack, you can certainly attest to that from hearing me complain about it so often, but this is a different thing because there's a change, a noticeable change, new equipment. Seems like the horse has been brought to life. I could see him running a much improved race from his preps. To win, though, probably not. Maybe to be a board hitter at the max. But the Fountain of Youth was a good race. Just beat on the spot by Forte in the Arkansas Derby. He was strung out pretty wide throughout. He was not able to save any ground under Junior Alvarado. Now, that's not going to be any different in the Derby because he drew a whole 18, and he's going to want to fit a similar trip. But once again, maybe it wasn't the ground so much as the lack of focus that he could be gaining from adding the blinkers.
And now we're going to move on to horse number 19, and that is Lord Miles, winner of the Wood Memorial. And Lord Miles is very peculiar when we take a look at the Wood Memorial because, and I don't want to I don't want to, hindsight 2020 this, but it isn't crazy to see how he improved from the Tampa Bay Derby into the Wood Memorial, because this is a horse that, and if you go back to some of the things that we were talking about him, and specifically after the Mucho Macho Man into the Holy Bull, I thought this was a horse that needed two turns, and eventually he got that. Well, he did get that in both the Holy Bull and the Tampa Bay Derby, but those are both, those were at Gulfstream and Tampa, which are both tracks that can kind of be sink or float tracks for horses in some fashions. And Lord Miles went up to Aqueduct, ran in the Wood Memorial, and he took out the Wood Memorial in good enough fashion. He was able to fight with Dreamlike and hit show there, and eventually did get the nose down on the wire there. So in one fashion, I think that moving up to, or I think getting out to a more traditional two-turn type of race benefited him there, but I just have a hard time seeing how, I don't really like Hit Show at all in this race, and I think that the Wood Memorial was just overall a very weak race. I just have a hard time seeing how Lord Miles is going to move up in competition to be able to run a solid effort in this Kentucky Derby.
Yeah, I just think the Wood Memorial was a very weak race that he got a really good ride, and Paco Lopez did a good job keeping him engaged and getting the job done. But, he was able to sit forward in that race. There wasn't a lot of speed in general, so that also played a part in it. I would expect him to be a little further back in this race in the opening stages. And outside of the Wood Memorial, which was a very weak race, by all metrics and visually, there is nothing to like about his resume. So it'd be very surprising. There's not much I can add because I just don't think there are many positives. Maybe also, like you kind of alluded to, the addition in distance, maybe a mile and a quarter will move him forward even more. But once again, kind of stretching to get to those kinds of places and view him as a logical contender to run well.
And now we are going to move on to the final horse, and that is Continuar, owner of the Japanese auto bid into the Kentucky Derby. And Continuar was third in the UAE Derby. He didn't run a bad race there, but he's a horse that is going to have to overcome a lot. And I think he might be interesting as a plays horse because he did come on very well towards the end of the race in November, where Derma Sotogake won at Hanshin, where he was second there. And I think that he came on well toward the end of that race. But I think that this is a horse, and it's weird to say about a horse who's by Dre Fong, but I think that this is a horse that, honestly, maybe might need a little bit more distance in him, but also I think him being buried out in post 20, it just leaves a big mountain to climb for him. And I think also just how good is he really compared to the rest of the group here. So he's going to lose a lot of ground. He's going to have to come from probably very far back. I don't really think he presents a whole lot of upside aside from, he does have, I will give him his credit. He does have the good placings behind Derma Sotogake, and he will be a big price, and Yoshiro Yahagi can train a racehorse. So Continuar makes a lot of sense in those fashions, and I certainly wouldn't fault anybody for taking a flyer on him, especially with the show, because he is a horse that I think will appreciate 1.25 miles. I just think that there are horses that will appreciate it more than him, that will be similar prices to him. Kind of the same thing that I brought up with Sun Thunder.
Yeah, I don't really see much with this one. Obviously, the outside post is pretty brutal, and while he ran okay in the Middle East, it certainly was not high-quality horses. After Continuar, especially in the UAE Derby, not much to write home about. Even the field he beat in the race that earned him the most points in Japan, the Katlea show, the horses were not that talented. So I just don't think there's enough quality to his resume. Terrible setup from this point on. It's just very, very hard to envision a scenario where he is able to improve enough and win the Kentucky Derby.
And now we're going to very quickly talk about the also eligibles in this Kentucky Derby. We've got 3 right now. Number 21 would be Cyclone Mischief if he were to draw in. And I think Cyclone Mischief is actually has the least chance of the 3 horses on the also eligible list. A very good allowance victory back in January at Gulfstream, but didn't go well in the Holy Bull, and then kind of ran the same race in both the Fountain of Youth and the Florida Derby. He would be closer to the pace in this Kentucky Derby, and he will be very hopeless one way or another. So if somebody comes out, he's the first horse in. He's an easy pass. Mandarin Hero is a very big wild card because he has a lot of really good form from Japan. He was kind of running in some of the what is referred to as the lesser tracks over there, but then he comes over, runs in the Santa Anita Derby, and runs Practical Move up to a nose in there. And if you really like the effort from Practical Move, Mandarin Hero is a very big, very interesting wild card in this year's Kentucky Derby. I would hope that he draws in because he deserves to be in the Kentucky Derby a lot more than I think, certainly Cyclone Mischief, but I think a couple of the other horses who earned spots in the Kentucky Derby, even though they did run more than him, he ran better in his final prep than some of the other horses in this Kentucky Derby did. So that's Mandarin Hero. And then for King Russell, runner-up in the Arkansas Derby, I think he's one that will appreciate 1.25 miles. If he can draw in, he'll be a massive long shot. I would consider taking a flyer on him, but I think the odds of him getting in, he's 23, are very remote. I'm not going to rule out the possibility of 3 horses coming out and him getting in, and then eventually thinking, okay, he might actually be able to hit the board. But he's not going to get into the Kentucky Derby, so I'm not going to do any kind of rich strike things with him. But improving at the right time, 50 to 1 a horse that you could 50 to 1 in the morning line will be significantly higher than that, a horse that would be worth taking a flyer on. Your thoughts on the also eligibles, Eric?
Cyclone Mischief, he's been overmatched in every single graded stake start, and I don't see that being any different here, especially from post 21. Not going to be able to work over. Mandarin Hero is interesting because he'll be a big one-run type, but he can be tactical enough to sit within, relation to the lead. And if he were to get in, Cyclone Mischief got him, which means the pace might be a little quicker. So that's another thing we would have to consider from that perspective. But Mandarin Hero is a horse I would be using on all my tickets should he get in, because I think second time in the U.S., already having a start in the country, is going to do wonders compared to his countrymates, one of which I also think has a decent chance. King Russell, absolutely not for me. Ran well in the Arkansas Derby, but it was entirely due to the setup, and he will not be getting that in the Derby, so he's a very big pass for me.
With that being said, we're going to move on now to our picks in this year's Kentucky Derby, and there's a reason why I went on the giant tangent for the UAE Derby with Derma Sotogake, and that's because I'm going to pick him in this year's Kentucky Derby. Again, post 17 be damned, over 18 record of horses coming out of the UAE Derby be damned. I think this is legitimately one of the best horses that has ever been brought over from Maidan to the Kentucky Derby, and you take a look at the efforts that he had in Japan when he was running on dirt. Now, some of his form is muddied from turf races, but turf races aside, the race at Hanshin on November 6th, 2022, very, very, very good effort. The race, the next start out, which was going, now that was going a mile and an eighth, the next start going a mile. So slight cutback in trip. Barely won that race, don't know how. Saudi Derby, complete toss, as I mentioned, and then the UAE Derby, yes, he got carried by inside speed, all that, but his Japanese form is enough for me to be confident that he's going to be he's a talented horse. And I think that it was very, the Japan, I thought that it was very interesting to give him 2 starts in the Middle East, even though the Saudi Derby kind of just served as a prep into the UAE Derby. But both of those were good efforts for him. But I know that this is a quality racehorse because of the efforts that he ran in Japan. So Derma Sotogake will be my win pick in this year's Kentucky Derby. My thing every year with the Kentucky Derby also, if you're new this year to Racing Rundown, every single year I will give out a horse that is a big price and say this is the horse who's going to hit the board. Racing Rundown has had some success with that as of late, and I'm plugging this just because I want you to know that we put a lot of time and thought into these types of horses that we go with. So 3 of the horses that I have gone with since I started doing Racing Rundown in 2019. We had in 2019, my horse that I said was going to hit the board as the big long shot was Country House. Country House, of course, ran second, was eventually elevated to the win in the Kentucky Derby. 2020 was enforceable, didn't go so well. 2021, Hidden Stash didn't go so well. And then last year, notably, Rich Strike was a horse that I guaranteed was going to hit the board in the Kentucky Derby, and he did that. So I'm 500 on that front. 2 very successful horses, 2 not so successful horses, but I do have to give a shout out to our friend Jay Privman, who backed us up in 2020 when both Eric and I whiffed on it. Jay was able to give out Mr. Big News as the big priced horse that was going to hit the board in the Kentucky Derby. So 3 of the last 4 Kentucky Derbies we have been able to produce that. None of us were able to get Mandaloon in 2021. So that's the context I lay out before I give you Disarm. He placed really well in the Louisiana Derby, move up in triple, serve him very well. I think the Lexington killed his value, and I'm not really looking for a super huge price for him. Obviously, I'd love for him to be around I'd love for him to be 30, 35, 40 to 1, but if he's 25, 30, I'm okay with that. I think that this is a horse that is improving right at the right time. A mile and a quarter is going to be perfect for him, and I'm glad that he got the opportunity to run in the Lexington, get into the Kentucky Derby, and then also, on another front, the Lexington killed his value, because this was a horse that I didn't like at all after the Louisiana Derby, because everybody was wise-guying him, and my rule is, if he's everybody else's wise guy horse Derby week, he's not my wise guy horse. He's not everybody else's wise guy horse Derby week. That's going to be Skinner for this type of horse. So I think Disarm fits that bill perfectly for me. He is my choice on that front.
And my choice on top of this year's Derby will be Practical Move coming in from California. You know, you can knock him all you want, but he's a horse who knows how to win. You can make up these excuses that he can't get the distance, but he can. I mean, I laid it out with the pedigree. You might look at the Santa Anita Derby and say, oh, well, he's getting tired lately. Yeah, because he's close to a hot pace. That's not going to be happening here. He's going to be able to sit a really nice trip. He's going to sit within 3 or 4 lengths of the lead, progressively get closer on the turn, and get first run on all of the other favorites who are going to be coming from farther off the pace in him. And that's really what's going to set him up for success in Rise, is getting first run, because I don't think he'll be stopping when they run through the lane. So obviously all that, the figures were the last thing I really cared about. But of course, if you buy into those, then you like this horse quite a bit. And I thought the San Felipe two-back was a true reflection of his horse's ability, and it's similar to a trip that he could find here in the San Felipe. He said a good stalking trip, make the move when it matters, and tear away down the lane. So I'm really, really feeling good about this horse, who just feels like he's doing all the right things as he marches towards the Kentucky Derby. My prize horse, I don't feel any confidence in any of them this year. I'm usually a one horse per race kind of guy, so I will say Rocket Can looks like a horse that could run well, because I do believe Bill Mott wouldn't be putting the blinkers on if he didn't think this horse had a big chance to fire well in this Derby. He wouldn't be in the Derby if he didn't think he could run an okay race, and I think that he will solve some of the problems that he caused for himself in Arkansas and in the Fountain of Youth. So I think he sits a good stalking trip. He can run all day and sticks around, at least run in the top 5 at the worst.
And with that being said, that's going to be it for our Kentucky Derby profile preview and pick show in 2023. Be sure to check out the link in the description to our Kentucky Oaks picks show, the same style that we did this, and also check out our individual Kentucky Derby profiles for the horses running in this year's Kentucky Derby, and also be sure to check out episode number 209 of Racing Rundown this week. We will see you throughout the course of this Derby week for the remainder of the stuff that we will be producing this week. Have a good one, and good luck with your Derby choices.